Wow, it's wonderful to see all these people coming in. What a fabulous turnout. We're going to give it a few minutes while people join us. Good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. I know we have a lot of people joining us from different parts of the world, from England, from Germany, as well as the US. I think a few people are putting things in the chat about where they're joining from. That's really great.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for doing that. I'm going to get started, even though people will continue to join us, but we have a very full program today, and I'm very excited about it. So I want to start on time. So I want to welcome all of you to the Poets Corner. I'm just so pleased to see this fabulous turnout for the launch of Mark Burrows' newest book, The Wandering Radiance, a selection of poems by Hilde Domin. I want to thank Mercy by the Sea Conference and Retreat Center in Madison, Connecticut, for collaborating with us to bring you today's program in celebration of National Poetry Month. Before we introduce Mark and our very distinguished guests this afternoon, I want to tell you about a few upcoming events on the Poets Corner. The Poets Corner, for those of you who don't know, it was launched by myself and Catherine Seitz in June of 2020 to create community around writers and readers of poetry and short prose. Over the past 3 years, that community has grown to more than 3,000 people with a variety of programs every month, mostly on Zoom. In April, we'll have a second reading on April 23rd called Malama Aina, which is Hawaiian language for honor the earth. We have an open call for eco-poetry that closes tomorrow night at midnight, April 3rd. And from that, we'll select 10 to 12 poems to be read on the Zoom event on Sunday, April 23rd at 4 p.m. John Paul Caponegro is co-hosting this event with me. On Sunday, May 7th, we have Clock of Cream and Flame, Mothers on Motherhood, and that's a line from a Sharon Olds poem. So that program has Megan Sterling, Catherine Hagopian-Berry, Abby Murray, and Sonia Greenfield, reading poems that take a close look at the complex role of mothers and motherhood. On May 20th, if you're anywhere in or near Midcoast, Maine, you should come to the first ever Camden Festival of Poetry with our featured keynote speaker, Richard Blanco, a host of local poets and musicians, and some very interesting breakout discussion groups. It's the afternoon of Saturday, May 20th. And in June, the Poets Corner is launching our Corner Craft Talk series. And the first of these is about hybrid forms with Julie Marie Wade, who's the author of, I think more than 9 books and a real expert on hybrid forms, a professor at Florida International University. Look for the invitation, and we hope that you'll sign up for this interesting webinar. Phew, that's a lot, and I don't want to steal any time away from today's wonderful program. Most of you here know Mark Burrows, either personally, through his teaching and his ministry, or perhaps you've attended one of the amazing sessions he's already done for the Poets' Corner on the poet Rilke. Mark is a renowned scholar and an award-winning translator of Rilke. He's also a sensitive and contemplative poet, the author of several books, and co-founder with me of the Camden Festival of Poetry. He's a neighbor in the lovely town of Camden, Maine, and someone I've been lucky to get to know over the past couple of years and to call a friend. I'll let him tell you about this new book of poems from a poet he's translated for the first time into English. I'll simply say that my understanding of not only of Domin, a poet that I didn't know before and hadn't heard of before, but also her inspiring message of being in the world is enlightened and expanded, especially in the introductory essays, the foreword, and an essay by Domin herself in the front of this book. So please join me in welcoming this distinguished group of guests, along with Mark Burrows, and Mark will introduce each of the others that are here with us today. So just please give a warm welcome to Mark Burrows.
Thank you so very much, Meg. And it's just a joy to be your colleague and a colleague with all of you who are joining me on this program. And what a delight to have so many of you with us. My thanks to all of you for coming. I have friends and colleagues from Germany who are with us, from Australia, from the UK, and from across the United States. So it's really an international gathering. And I think it's appropriate that a poet like Hilde Domin gathers such a widely diverse group of people from so many parts of the world. I first met Hilde Domin's writings when I was a guest professor in a city called Wuppertal in 2007. Hilde Domin died at the age of 96 the year before, and I was a student of German literature and an avid reader of poetry, but for whatever reason, I had not really encountered her poetry. It was a woman, a young doctoral student named Vera Sabina Winkler, who presented on her, and I immediately realized this is a poet who's a kindred soul, somebody I wanted to know more about. I eventually applied for a residency and received it at the Santa Fe Art Institute. I'm grateful for their support, and won a the Witterbinner Prize in Poetry that year to start work on this translation. That was 10 years ago in 2013. So those years have been filled with many other things. I spent most of that time in Germany teaching in Bochum. Some of my friends and colleagues from Bochum are with us, I know. And found myself on so many occasions with people who loved Hilde Domin, who had a favorite poem that was put up on their bulletin board or on their office board or in their home. She is one of those beloved voices, really, in German society. And what I'd like to do in the next few minutes is very briefly talk about her life before I turn to Marion Tauschwitz, who is a distinguished writer in her own right and the biographer of Hilde Domin, wrote the definitive biography of Domin, and Chris Nelson, who is my publisher and is joining us from Grinnell, Iowa, Marion from Heidelberg, Germany, Domin's where she spent the last 50 years of her life, and the British poet and essayist and literary critic and friend, Hilary Davis. But first, just a few words about Hilde Domin. Born in 1909 in the city of Cologne to a well-established family there in a very self-assured Jewish community. Cologne had a vibrant life. Jewish life before the Second World War. She began her studies in Heidelberg and eventually in Bonn, Berlin, and then back to Heidelberg, before realizing in 1932 that the clouds were darkening and that she needed to leave Germany. And she did with her beloved Erwin Palm. They went to Italy as students on a student visa. Eventually, both did their doctoral work there and stayed until it was no longer possible when, in March 1939, the Italian fascist government published laws really threatening any Jewish resident or citizen in Italy. They fled first to Paris and on to England, where they joined Hilde Domin's parents, who'd escaped in 1933, Germany. They lived there for a period before moving to Oxford and eventually a small village called Minehead in Somerset. And when France capitulated in 1940, they realized, along with many Jews who'd found refuge in England, that it was a precarious place for them to stay. And so they boarded a ship in Liverpool in June of that year and sailed toward Canada. And eventually they had received a visa to disembark in the Dominican Republic. So when Hilde Löwenstein eventually married in Italy during her Italian years, became Hilde Palm, she remained Hilde Palm until returning to Germany in 1954. Now, one of the connections, where I finished this book living in Camden, Maine. And as I was telling Marion, when I walked down to the ocean front here, which is a few hundred yards from where we live, if you look out to the east, you see Vinyl Haven, an island where Hilde Domin spent a summer, a very happy summer. In fact, she said one of the happiest summers of her life in 1953. Eventually, she and her husband returned to Germany in 1954, among the few Jewish exiles who survived the war, who did return to Germany, and went on to become one of the most distinguished voices in the literary world in Germany. She only began writing poems, though, a few years before then, on the death of her mother in 1952, and spent the next 50-some years becoming really quite a remarkable presence in the literary scene. She called herself the poet of the second chance, and she believed that somehow her poetry was the poetry, she said, of the nevertheless. These are poems of the dennoch, of the nevertheless. In the face of all the horrors in this world, nevertheless, we will create art. We will stand on the side of beauty. We will give voice to hope in the most despairing of times. In my introduction to her, and I wrote a lengthy one because she's relatively unknown among English readers, I quoted lines from an address she gave to a group of graduating students from a gymnasium in the city of Leverkusen, where she said this: "I appeal to a sober, unguarded kind of emancipation, without retreating, abandoning no one who trusts you. I advocate for that which is uncomfortable, which is practiced on the far side of slogans, without publicity and without noise. The miracle, the concrete small miracle, waits around the corner for those who are ready to perceive it." I'd like to hear Hilde Domin. Oops, it looks like I've lost my connection there. Let me begin with a poem of Hilde Domin's. Perhaps I can get that up later on. It was a poem, first the last stanza of a longer poem, and eventually she published it separately. It's a little poem called Nicht müde werden, Don't Grow Weary, is my translation of the title. And it simply goes like this. It's 5 lines. Don't grow weary, but hold your hand out quietly to wonder, as if to be as if to a bird. Hold your hand out quietly to the miracle, as if to a bird. That sense that she had that the miracle was waiting for us around every corner, in every moment, if we had the courage to look for it and the eyes to see it, characterized not just her writing, but I think her entire life. And the poem I'll end with, which is a poem that she often read at the end of readings, and she read avidly until the last year of her life, all across Germany, to small groups in churches, groups in schools, public gatherings, and so on. In fact, when she died in 2006, her funeral was something of a kind of state event. The Minister of Culture came and spoke. And there were thousands of people from Heidelberg and from across Germany who came to honor this remarkable woman. The poem some of you will know very well. It's called Abel, steh auf, Abel, get up. And I read it as a kind of midrash on the ancient story of Cain and Abel, which most of you will know. These brothers, Cain and Abel, and Cain rises up and kills his brother Abel. And as the rabbis often did with biblical stories, they muse about what the story might have meant, or might have been, or how it could be read differently or experienced in another way. And this poem, I think, is a quintessential glimpse into the courage and the beauty, I think, of Hilde Domin's life and vocation. Abel, get up. It must be done again. Every day it must be done again. Every day the answer must be before us. The answer, yes, must be possible. If you don't get up, Abel, how should the answer, this answer, which is the only important one, ever change? We could close all the churches and do away with all the law books in all the languages of the earth. If you would only get up and reverse this, the first wrong answer, to the only question that matters. Get up. So that Cain says, so that he can say, I am your keeper, brother. How could I not be your keeper? Get up every day so that we have this before us. This, yes, I am here. I, your brother, so that Abel's children won't be afraid any longer, because Cain won't be Cain. I write this, I, a child of Abel, and I fear the answer every day. The air in my lungs diminishes as I wait for the answer. Abel, get up, so that it can begin differently between us all. The fires that burn, the fire that burns upon the earth should be Abel's fire, and the tail of the rocket should be Abel's fires. The miracle would be that we learn to stand and be for our brothers and sisters, particularly those endangered and in greatest need, that we could be their brother, that we would be their sister, that we would stand in solidarity with them, and in a sense, be for them the hope that they can't find without us. Well, that's a little glimpse into Hilde Domin's life and at least one set of poems. I'd like to turn next to Marion Tauschwitz, who wrote the definitive biography of Hilde Domin, a distinguished poet in her own right, novelist, essayist. And for the last 6 or 7 years of Hilde Domin's life, she became almost a daughter, the daughter Hilde Domin never had, a confidant for sure, and a friend. And in some ways, I was thrilled when I wrote to Marion and asked if she would consider writing a foreword to this book. And she immediately wrote back and said, of course, I'd be honored to do that. And so the book is graced. The first words are the words of someone who knew Hilde Domin well, and who I think understands so much about her that we need to know. So Maren, thank you for being with us, and I give you the word.
Hello there. Thank you for having been invited. I'm very happy to be with you tonight. Well, tonight in Germany, afternoon in your countries. Well, in fact, there are so many things I'd like to add now concerning Abel steh auf and the little wonder of nicht müde werden. And maybe just a few words to Abel steh auf. So the idea was born in 1946 in Santo Domingo. Santo Domingo wasn't a republic then, it was governed by a dictatorship, Trujillo. And the young couple Palm came there, and they felt lost, of course. They didn't know what to do there. And Hilde Domin wrote poems, and they both translated poems. And Erwin Walter Palm, the husband, he said, well, it's no good that women do poems. It's a man's job. Only men can write poems. And if you do so, I will take your breath away. And that Hilde Domin pledged all through her life. Please, she waited for the answer. She waited for him to say, yes, yes, this, yes, as we have heard in Abel steh auf, yes, you will be allowed to write poems because, well, you know, Cain can be saved only if Abel gets back to life, because, and if Erwin Walter Palm says, yes, you are a poet, then he can come back to life and she can appreciate his doing as well. So it's very interesting, because then in Spain she continued with the poem in 1957. And maybe you have heard the difference right in the end, that the last two stanzas, I asked Hilde Domin and said, well, I've got the feeling that they don't belong to Abel steh auf, you know. Abel steh auf, dass alles anders anfängt zwischen uns allen. And then suddenly there comes the fire of the rockets. And I had the feeling that that doesn't fit. And she smiled and says, yes, right in the beginning, I stopped with Abel get up, that everything can start right from the beginning. And but after she had seen the landing on the moon, it was in 1969, she added those two stanzas because she thought, well, if those rockets go over there, they can come back from the moon as well. And she had the idea, and she prayed that it will never happen again, that the fire from somewhere from the universe comes back to the earth. So it's a very interesting story. It's a dialectic thing as well. And well, the secret of Hilde Domin's poems is that she kind of de-individualized all her stanzas, all her poems, because then they get the magical thing that everybody can use. It's a magischer Gebrauchsgegenstand, she used to say. That's very important to her. Well, there are so many things. I'm full of like a glass with olives, so that I could talk about the poems. And I think they are ever so interesting because they have the background of real life, and that's what makes them feel so alive as well. So it's not the life of Hilde Domin being in those poems, but it's life itself, and that's why many people appreciate and find themselves in her poems as well. I wanted to tell you in a few words how I met Hilde Domin. That was very amazing, because I queued in Heidelberg in a museum to get a book signed by the famous poet. And I would like to read out two stanzas of the translation Mark had done. Es gibt dich. You exist because eyes were very important to Hilde Domin. She said, my eyes are the most important thing. So right from her childhood, her eyes were fascinating. And if you look at the eyes, then you start existing. I'm going to read out the German first and then the English version as well. Es gibt dich. Dein Ort ist, wo Augen dich ansehen. Wo sich die Augen treffen, entstehst du. Es gibt dich, weil Augen dich wollen, dich ansehen und sagen, dass es dich gibt. You exist. There are places where eyes look upon you, where eyes meet is where you come into being. You are because eyes desire you, look at you and say that you exist. And that is exactly that she had wanted to be seen. So when she signed my book, she looked up at me and said, oh, how lovely. Would you like to come and join us for dinner? Yes, of course I wanted to. And of course I went with them. And we chatted well, but too briefly, both of us thought. And so Hilde Domin invited me to her place. Oh, her place. You must visit me at my poet's tower, she said, because yes, it was a tower like a famous poet Annette Droste-Hülshoff had as well. It's not an apartment, it's a fortress, an enclave, retreat for stranded souls, removed from the noise of the city without being removed from it, quite close to famous Heidelberg Castle. On my first visit, and that shows the way Hilde Domin acted and she was as a person, Hilde Domin had ordered me at 6 minutes to 3:30. What a crazy time. Hilde Domin was keen on punctuality and speed even in her old age. When I wait for something, she said, it has to come like this. And she snapped her fingers. And of course, I was on time. I had brought roses and strawberry cake. I'll tell you more about the roses in a minute. But the thing with the strawberry cakes could have been my undoing. Hilde Domin distributed the cupcake on 2 plates. She immediately halved her portion. You know, I eat like a little bird. A little bird is an image she used to have very often. Oh, I would hear this sentence hundreds of times. Later, we carried the dishes into the kitchen and washed up by hand. And then one of the little cake forks was missing. Here looms, carried through all the exiles. We searched in all the rooms, under the table, in the hallway, in the kitchen, to no avail. Oh dear, my first visit to the great poet, and a golden cake fork was missing. It would be my last visit there, because she had to connect me with the loss. Where could the fork have been lost? I reviewed the afternoon. I eat like a little bird. She had cut the tartlet in half and later wrapped the half in the paper and put it in the fridge. And there exactly where was the missing fork. It was stuck in the cake, ready to eat. Oh, how wonderful, she said. And the situation was over. And that was the beginning of our friendship. We spent more and more time together talking about poems, about books, our lives. And by the years, we became very familiar. That was easy. That was hard. Because Hilde Domin demanded the whole person. She wanted to trust him or her in any way. And that had been all through her life the condition for enduring an exile together. That was very important, and that's just the beginning of our friendship. And I'd like to read out, is there still some minutes left for me? I'd like to read the poem Only a Rose for Support, because it's one of the most important poems of Hilde Domin, because it gave her her name, kind of. And should I read the English version only? It's better. I furnish a room in the air among acrobats and birds, my bed on the trapeze of feeling, like a nest in the wind, on the branches' outermost tips. I buy a blanket made of the softest wool from the gentle-headed sheep that wander in the moonlight like shimmering clouds above the solid earth. I close my eyes and wrap myself in the fleece of those dependable animals.
Mary, how are you?
I want to feel the sand beneath their small hooves and hear the click of the latch that locks the stable in the evening. But I lie in bird feathers, cradled high in the void. I'm dizzy. I don't fall asleep. My hand reaches for a firm hold and finds only a rose for support. Roses had always been more than flowers for Hilde Domin. They kind of replaced people. She garlanded the photos of her deceased parents with fresh roses to stay in conversation with them. When she traveled by train, she bought a rose right at the station so that the hotel room would not be so strange to her. Roses and Hilde, they simply belong together. She welcomed the flowers by a kiss and breathed a farewell kiss on the faded heads before parting with them. The very rose in the poem was not the German language, as literary scholars would later interpret. On the 3rd November in 1957, when Domin worked on her poem, a real rose on her bedside table had given her emotional support and hope. Yes, this rose later even slept on her pillow, she confessed to Hermann Hesse, the famous poet, some years later, for the rose was a gift from her publisher with whom she had fallen in love too. Well, as you can see, the greatest challenge for a poet is to de-individualize the intimate things, to remove the factual. Hilde Domin succeeded in looking at her once written lies with complete distance in a purely literary way. She compared herself to a gardener, weeding a garden. She had cut and she took out.
Got a good turnout.
The poet had found the unspecific exactness that is a famous feature of her poems. The secret of Hilde Domin's poems is that she made them into magical objects of use, applicable for everyone. The poem Only a Rose for Support is more than a poem, is more than just the title of her first book of poems. It was a confession, born in the moment of a fleeting existence, but manifested Hilde Domin's fame. And at the end, I would like to show you two huge photos of Hilde Domin that you get the idea how she looked like and what her eyes were like at the age of 96. The photo was taken then at that time. And the other one is that reminds us right to the beginning, because the way she holds her hands is as if she was waiting for the wonder, as if she would like to shelter a little bird.
Oh, Marion, thank you so much for this intimate glimpse into Hilde Domin's life and her passions, her beauty and her tenacity. What a remarkable woman, and how marvelous that you've opened her life to us in this very intimate way. Thank you so much. And thank you for writing such a beautiful foreword for this book. I'm so grateful.
You're welcome. It was a pleasure.
Next, we turn to Chris Nelson. Chris is my publisher of Green Linden Press in Grinnell, Iowa. He's a prize-winning poet in his own right and founded a journal called Under the Warm Green Linden, which is, I think, where Chris discovered these Hilde Domin. He asked if I was working on any other poems, and I said, well, I have these poems of this German Jewish writer named Hilde Domin. He said, oh, well, send some. And you're one of the first people who published these translations some years ago. So I'm grateful to you, Chris, not just for your choosing to publish this book, but for the unswerving commitment you've given to make sure this book is what it needs to be, which is, in a sense, a gesture of the dignity and the beauty and the power of this remarkable woman. So welcome, Chris, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Mark. It's a pleasure to be joining you today to celebrate this publication of The Wandering Radiance. But more largely, it's been a great honor over the past couple of years to work with you to bring this book forward. Maybe just a little bit about Green Linden Press to give some people some context for how Mark and I met. We're a nonprofit poetry press based in Grinnell, Iowa. And as Mark mentioned, we have an online journal called Under a Warm Green Linden. We started that in 2008, and then in 2017, we began publishing books as well. Our nonprofit mission is in addition to fostering excellent poetry, to support reforestation efforts. And so a portion of our proceeds goes to reforestation. We've planted 650 or so trees to date. We publish chapbooks of poetry, broadsides. We have an annual prize called the Wishing Jewel, which is given for poetic innovation. And most recently, we've added the Stephen Mitchell Prize for translation. I met Mark through an editorial project I was doing a couple of years back. It was called Essential Voices, The Poetry of Iran and Its Diaspora. It was an anthology. And Mark has translated, as some of you are probably aware, the poems of German Iranian exile Said. Mark's book of translations called 99 Psalms is really a remarkable book that should belong in every library. Well, a selection from that book is in this Iranian anthology that I edited. And so that's how I first became acquainted with Mark, and then I became aware of his project that has gone on, I believe you said at the beginning, about 12 years, your translation work of Hilde Domin. 12 years dedicated to one book, that is evidence of his hard work, but also his fidelity to getting this as good as it can be. And it's really been an honor to work with Mark and to see that dedication in action. Well, he mentioned the manuscript, and I said, well, of course, I would love to see it, though I wasn't familiar with the work of Hilde Domin. Like many of you, I was familiar with her German contemporaries, Nelly Sachs and Paul Celan and Günter Grass et al. But if you don't read German, Domin really hasn't been available in English until now, at least not in book form. You could find a few poems here and there, maybe. Well, the Iranian anthology that I mentioned, it's part of the Essential Voices series, and it has the intention to make less insular the various poetries of the world. And immediately upon reading the manuscript of The Wandering Radiance, I felt this real alignment with that intention. Like these were poems that people needed to read, a book the world needs, is how I felt. And so it certainly aligned with the press's intentions. In her work, you know, like I think most readers will feel, there's a beauty, there's a hopefulness, and there's a sort of spiritual journey. You get the sense that her life, as evidenced through her poetry, is a sort of spiritual journey. And, you know, maybe that's because of the challenging circumstances she endured. So I'm going to read a few poems in just a minute. I do want to acknowledge what a gift I think this is, that Mark has brought these poems into English. You know, today is, of course, a celebration of Hilde Domin, but it's also a celebration of more than a decade of work from Mark. What a gift for all of us. Thank you. Some of you may have already got a copy of the book. If you haven't, I would encourage you to check out the catalog at Green Linden Press. I'll put a link in the chat so you can do that. And if you buy a book, you can enter Domin, D-O-M-I-N, at checkout and get free shipping in the United States. If you're international and you want a copy of the book and you can't find it, I'll put my email there too, and you can send a quick note and I'll direct you on how to get a copy internationally. Okay, so how about some poems? These are some of a few of my favorites that, you know, editing a book, it's really interesting, the sort of relationship one develops with the poems. You know, you look at them with a critical eye, but you end up reading them so many times that they become almost like talismans, some of them. And this first one that I want to share is certainly of that way for me. It's called Appeal. 1. Don't go as one burning out. Don't go as one burning out. Don't go as one burning out into the extinction. Burn, burn. We are torches, my brother. We are stars. We are something burning, something rising, or we've not been at all. 2. A body like ours is only the sheathing of the balloon, penetrable by light. This one's called On the Cloud's Guarantee. I am homesick for a land where I've never been, where all the trees and flowers know me, to which I will never go, but where the clouds remember me exactly. A stranger who has no home in which to shed all their tears. I travel toward islands without harbors. I throw the keys into the sea as soon as I depart. I arrive nowhere. My sail is like a cobweb in the wind, but it doesn't tear. And beyond the horizon, where the great birds dry their wings in the sun at the end of their migration, there's a continent where they must take me in without a passport, on the cloud's guarantee. And I'll read one more poem before turning it back to Mark. This is called Art is Long. The breath in a bird's throat, the breath of the air in the branches. The word, like the wind itself, its holy breath goes out and in. The breath always finds branches clouds, birds' throats. Always finds the word, the holy word, a mouth. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chris, for beautiful sharing and reading, and for your commitment to poetry, and for your commitment to this book, and for your care in shepherding it to birth, really. Thank you. Our last guide is an old friend, Hilary Davis, coming to us from London. Hilary is well known as a poet with 4 marvelous collections, most recently The Exile and the Kingdom. And it's interesting because Hilde Domin, of course, for her, exile and homeland were great themes, vital themes, existential themes in her life and in her writing. Hilary is also a literary critic, an essayist, familiar to anyone reading literature in the UK and beyond. So Hilary, it's a delight and an honor and a mark of our friendship that you're joining us and that you're able to open these poems to us as a bilingual, I should say, reader of Hilde Domin. Welcome.
Well, thank you very much, Mark, and indeed everybody, Meg Weston, the Poets' Corner, for inviting me to take part tonight. It's a great honour. And I'm delighted to have been involved in however small a way with this project, talking to Mark about it over a period of time. A little bit of background: I read German and French at university, and I taught both languages here in Britain for 30 years or so. And I'm a poet who identifies myself as Anglo-Welsh, whose recent forebears' first language was not English. So I think as a European, and I'm profoundly influenced by the poetry of these 4 different literatures and cultures, that is English, Welsh, French and German. Yet when Mark first sent me his translations, Hilde Domin was a completely new name to me. And I'm very grateful to him for introducing me to her work. As a poet, I was completely captivated immediately and intrigued by her use of language, for I recognize that she does something which is extremely difficult to do. She pairs language right back to the absolute essentials of verb and noun. You'll find, if you look, that adjectives and adverbs are used extremely sparingly. Subclauses are kept short, and punctuation often disappears altogether. This has the effect of giving immense power to what she says, those words that remain. The subtle internal rhyme stands out, and the spare punctuation means that you must hover carefully in places to ascertain exactly what the meaning is of her words. These then come back to you like a harmony ringing after the note is struck, to hang in your mind and reveal the depth of echo and metamorphosis taking place in her poems. Her poems are like Eurydice, both present to us and yet speaking from another world, the other world of the actual foreign continents that she knew, but also of the past, of memory, of the realm of the dead. Letter to the other continent. Don't turn around to face me. Eurydice always with you, the hand touching your shoulder under the distant trees. When I was growing up, I was very conscious of the real historical events that had so displaced Hilde Domin, because my own aunt by marriage had been sent out of Germany to the UK on the Kindertransport. Astonishingly, her parents survived the whole of the war in Berlin, although other family members were not so fortunate. So for as far back as I can remember, I had amongst my relatives someone who had suffered persecution, dislocation, and the endless longing of exile. She used to tell me how much she missed the linden trees outside her childhood home. So you may imagine how poignant I found the name of the publishers of the Wandering Radiance when I saw it, Green Linden Press. For Domin, it is the almond tree that takes on that symbolism. Where is our almond tree? I lie in your arms, darling, like the almond kernel in its shell. Tell me, where is our almond tree? I lie in your arms as if in a ship without a route or harbour, but with dolphins at the bow. Beneath our backs, a cord of beds, our beds in many lands, in the nowhere of the night, when all around a strange room sinks down. Wherever we come to, darling, everything's different. Everything's the same. Everywhere, hay is stacked differently to dry under the same sun. One of the greatest losses an exile experiences is the loss of their mother tongue. You're rendered dumb amongst those who are indifferent to you or even hostile. Many strive to forget their childhood language in order to fit in, but I believe you never lose that other angle on the world that a specific language culture gives you. When a language dies, another continent dies. For a person exiled from that world, a death comes long before you in fact die, as Hilde Domin tells us in this very moving poem about her father. And I'll read it in the German first because it's a very short poem. Exil, meinem Vater. Der sterbende Mund müht sich das richtig gesprochene Wort einer fremden Sprache. Exile for my father. The dying mouth struggles to find the rightly spoken word in a foreign tongue. Exile and refugeedom have always been part of the human experience, for good and ill. We are surrounded by it in the news that is brought us every day. Hilde Domin found kindness and friendship in the Dominican Republic, which gave her her writing name. In Fatherlands, she evokes for us how exile occasions giant paradoxes in both the fleeing and the welcoming people. The fear, the warmth, the compassion and the cruelty, the paradox of being human. Fatherlands. As many fatherlands as one has, fatherlandless, homelandless. Each new expulsion, a new land opens its arms, more or less. The arms of the immigration officers, and then the people. Always there are some there who open their arms. A gymnastic move in this century of feet, of arms. A disorderly use of our limbs. Something is always there that is worth loving. Something is never there. All these countries have borders against neighboring lands. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you so much, Hilary. What a marvelous chorus of of insight you've brought us. And indeed, with all of you, you've welcomed us into the remarkable depths and nuances and the power of these words of Hilde Domin, who spent 22 years of her life exiled from the country she grew up in, she was born in, and she loved. And in an act of, I think, either audacity or courage or craziness, chose to return to honor the language that she did not want to leave behind. And you've helped us, each of you, Marion and Chris and Hilary, understand something of the remarkable voice of this most extraordinary poet. When I set out to translate these poems, starting a dozen years ago, I never really imagined that they would be in print, but I knew that they should be, that we need these poems in these times. And I want to just close by reading just the last part of my introduction, and which is longer than an introduction to a collection of poems would normally need to be, except that Hilde Domin's story is largely unknown. And in point of fact, her poems without that story have a power and a meaning, but they lose something significant. So let me just close with a reading of a poem which she entitled Return, which I think is a kind of credo, could be read as a credo of her vocation as a poet. I call the words back to me. I lure all my words, the helpless ones. I gather the pictures, the landscapes come to me, the trees, the people. Nothing is far. They all gather so much brightness. I, a part of them all, return with all of them to myself and close myself and go forth out of the blossoming brightness, out of the green, the gold, the blue, into memorylessness. And I end with these words. Those who find themselves drawn by the lure of Domin's poems will understand her claim that writing, and therefore reading, is a training in reality. Whatever else poems do, in whatever form they live within us, they remind us, as she says in this poem, that nothing is far, that we too, no matter how deep the discouragements we face, have the capacity to come home in the word. That's her line. And that when we do, we discover dimensions by which we belong to each other and to every other thing. We need poems like these in times like ours as a needed counterweight to the widespread and growing experience of exile and bitter stories of persecution. We need them to remind us when we find ourselves courted by despair or numbed by an indifference to the suffering of others, that we belong to each other. I can almost hear Hilde Domin reminding us that these poems need us as well, for they must be enacted, just as experiences of injustice, often rooted in fundamental inequities, remain for us to address. These poems call to us, encouraging us in the struggle to embody what it means to live together equitably in a world burdened with injustice, and to live peaceably in societies fraught with violence. They need us to resist cruelty within the wounded ecosystem to which we belong together. And therein, she writes, lies the catharsis, in an ultimate faith in humanity, without which there could be no poetry. That's Hilde Domin. Domin's poems remind us that we need words and actions able to gesture beyond our fears, that move us toward the answer, yes, that must be possible. They point us again and again toward what she called the wandering radiance that is always close to us, like the large, slow hand that pushes away the hours on the clock face of our shoreline. We need poems like these that reassure us in the midst of the shadows falling upon us, that the realities of our lives are words, images, landscape, flowers, people, all, as she wrote, all gather so much brightness. Thank you. Meg, I'll turn it over to you for brief words, and then for those who wish to stay another half hour, we have some questions we can address from the chat room, and four of us will talk a little bit more about Domain for those who can stay.
That's great. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Marion, Hillary, Christopher. That was so wonderful. I love hearing these four different voices share with us your experience of Domain and hearing it in German as well as English. And what a delightful program. I want to thank you all for being here. And Mark, that forward, I just have to say, it just expands my view of the world, just from introducing me to her poetry, but also how meaningful it is today in what we're facing today. And I'm hopeful that as people put questions in the chat and as you're addressing some of those questions, that we'll touch on some of the ways it's so relevant, or her work is so relevant to us today, as you did in your final remarks. And I do want to encourage people to put questions in the chat. I'll look at them. Mark will look at them as we have this conversation for the next half hour or so. And I want to encourage everyone to come back on April 23rd for our Earth Day event as well. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Meg, for welcoming this program and for supporting my work and for our long friendship now in Camden. We've done so many things and the world is in front of us with so many more. I want to say just one quick word about something someone mentioned early on. What are the challenges of translating Hilde Domin? And it's a wonderful question, because in some ways, Hillary already mentioned this. One of the deepest difficulties in translating Domain is how compressed her language is. And because of the way that German functions as an inflected language, which we don't have, there are certain things that can't be, you have to add something, lest there's just confusion in the way that she puts together subject and object, often without verbs and without any kind of a wider structure. So I must say that some of these poems I spent hours, days, weeks coming back to again and again, trying to find not just a way of making her understandable, but conveying something of the feeling of her language, which is an extraordinary experience. Those of you who are German readers will know that. Something happens in the way she uses German. And I wonder, Marion, if I could ask you right off the bat, and of course, Hillary, you're also fluent in German, but Marion, let's begin with you. If you could talk a little bit about her use of language. You talked about this, the way she removed the facts of her own life to open the poems to a wider reception. What is it about that language that makes it so remarkable?
I think it's the images of the experience of exile that have burned under her skin of the heart. I think that is very important, that those pictures never vanished. She kept them in her heart, she kept them in her head. And if there was a comparable situation, all those pictures, all those experiences came out again, and she had the force and the strength to put them into words. That was her her gift, I suppose, because all through her life, in her youth especially, she had corrected her husband's verses and her husband's poems, and she said, well, you have to use another word that is too common, and please. So she had the handicraft kind of to teach him, and right from the beginning of her being together, and that is what she was being trained by the exiles as well, because then they started translating poems from German into Italian language and the other way around, and then they had to flee to England, and already on the boat, on the ferry boat, they translated English poems into German and the other way around, and she brushed up her English by an English poet, and they took his poems to the Dominican Republic, and they had Lorca bought Lorca's poems, they bought in London, and these were the first poems in Spanish that they translated into English, and then from English into German. And that was something that Hilde Domin said, what she did all through her life, that she translated one poem into the other language and back. And if they could stand still and hold the strength, then they were good poems.
Marvelous. That's marvelous. Yeah. Hilary, you were the first to read through the entire manuscript, together with my spouse Ute, who's somewhere on the program as well. And you had so many wonderful suggestions along the way. What was it like for you to discover these poems for the first time in German?
Yes, I hope that I conveyed a little bit of it. She's so spare in the words that she used, and I was interested in what Marion said, that she was very skilled as a translator, and there's nothing like translating poems from another language into your own for making you really, really think about the nuances of language, in both in that language and your own language. And there's a kind of sense, I think, that comes across from this, that she was very used to doing that. And I completely agree with you that this very pared back language makes it very difficult to get that sense of smallness, apparent smallness, which then starts to echo as you read them. I know it, for those of you who know the English poet Stevie Smith, and this may seem like a very strange point of comparison if you do know Stevie Smith, but Stevie Smith wrote very, very tight, small poems, not dissimilar from Hilde Domin's, even just to look at on the page, which then she had a wicked sense of humor, which perhaps doesn't come through so much in what Hilde Domin writes, but she had a way of turning the poem so that what appeared to be about one thing turned out to be another. And there are slight similarities between the work of those two women. I think that they begin very small and they resonate outwards.
No, that's beautiful. Another of the great poets of our time, a friend of mine, Jane Hirschfield, often comments that poems, to be poems that really last, need some sense of startlement. They need to startle something to give us a different way of seeing what we've looked at but never noticed before, a different way of feeling something that we've felt but have never had words for. And Marion, you're so right, the images that she uses are so poignant and so often so simple and cut right to the heart of human experience, not just her experience, Domin's, but our experience. Chris, I wonder for you, reading these poems with some German as well, you shared so beautifully of the poems that you found moving. And you've been a champion of poetry as a way of carrying culture. So when you think about this collection, you spoke a little bit about this. I wonder if you could just expand for a moment about how these poems carry something important about for us in our time, in the culture that we still share with Hilde Domin?
Yeah, thanks for asking. That's a great question. Well, as a publisher, kind of plugged into what all these other publishers are doing, and it's an exciting time to be a poet and a reader because of how much good poetry there is being written and published all the time. But at the risk of sounding maybe a little cynical, one encounters a lot of books that might be good, but does the world need them? I immediately felt like this is a book the world needs. These are poems that, without having access to her voice, her mind in English, there's a real loss, a tragic loss. And it's kind of amazing to me that a poet of such power and kind of historical and spiritual significance, if you will, even wasn't just immediately translated. Like I marvel at the fact that it's taken this long, but it's a complicated process, right? I mean, I'll reiterate, Mark has spent over 10 years making a book. So the complexity of her poetry, that you open a page, you can turn to any page, and I mean, it's just, they're spare, like Hillary was saying. There's often a lot more white space on a page than text, but and I think that actually makes it a harder translation job, paradoxically, because it's not so much about just, it's not a word for word thing. There's so much compression happening in the original language. So how do you convey all that's doing? So yeah, it's with great excitement that I'm part of the process in any way. And I just personally, as a poet, I'm really drawn to, I wouldn't call her a minimalist, but I'm really drawn to that compression of language where with just a few lines you can really move somebody. That's remarkable. And she does it again and again.
She has a little poem which she calls lyric, poetry, 4 lines long. Das Nichtwort ausgespannt zwischen Wort und Wort. The not word stretched out between word and word. And that's exactly what you're pointing to, that images, of course, create space for the reader, space for us to inhabit this language and to move beyond what's said to what's felt, what's expressed beyond language. I know, Maren, you were just trying to get in as well.
Yes, what is important for me, what I've experienced with Hilde Domin's poems is that they don't grow old. They stay alive. They are brand new and by actuality. Think of Save Us. There are some stanzas, and I have often quoted them when we thought about the fight of the Iranian women, when they say, "This is our freedom, naming the right names fearlessly, with a small voice, calling each other with a small voice, to call whatever's by name, with nothing but our breath." And I think it's a national anthem for the Iranian women, isn't it?
Yeah, that's so right. That's so right. I need to say too, because I think Marlies Hendricks, a dear friend with whom I lived for the last 1.5 years when I was teaching in Germany, which had already come back to the States. And we had this marvelous WG in her lovely apartment in Bochum. And she had on the door that I saw every time I left or came in, this little poem, which is such a puzzle and such a marvel. Who could do it? Wer es könnte? Wer es könnte die Welt hochwerfen, dass der Wind hindurchfährt? It's just an amazing poem. Let me read it to you in English. Who could do it? Who could do it? Throw the world so high that the wind could pass through it. beautiful rhyming there in the English, which is not there in the German, but there's something that rhymes in this image, this sense of desiring as we do to live more lightly in our life, to allow the wind, almost like the spirit, to move through our life, to throw the world, our world, so high that we could find a way of being different in it and being changed by that experience. So Marlies, thank you for that remarkable little poem that you blessed me with for the years we lived together in the Wittenberger Straße. Hilary, so what do you do as a translator when you face the kind of challenge? You're a translator as well, that the Domin's poems present. And what do you do when you translate a poem? I mean, it's not just moving language from German to English or whatever the target language is. So much more happens in translation.
Well, of course, all poems are translations. There's an analogy, I think, between what you're trying to do when you're writing a poem, which is to get something which is in here, out there for the reader, which will approximate to what you've got in your head and you hope will translate into the right words so that the reader also can enter that world. So in that sense, I think there's a real approximation between the act of writing and the act of translating. I mean, I don't think I'm the first person to have noticed that or commented on that. And so you're entering one world in order to recreate that world, but differently. I think there's a quotation somewhere where you works very, very hard in order to create something which is totally different and just the same. I think it's Günter Grass actually who said that. And you think, well, at first sight it seems like a sort of silly thing to have said, an oxymoron, but actually it's not. I mean, I think translation is like that. You're trying to say the same thing, but in a completely different medium.
Oh, it's
and
so true.
It's an approximate art.
It's an approximate art for sure. There's Rilke who once said that a poem is not a feeling, a poem is an experience.
Yes.
And when you read a poem, you experience something.
Yeah. Yeah.
So to try to translate a poem,
I feel quite strongly that poems aren't feelings. They're
no, they're not feelings. But
no.
How do you convey that experience so that somebody who can't have the poem in this case in German, has a poem in English and experiences something at least similar? And of course, Hilde Domin, you mentioned this, Marion, that she talked about these magische Gebrauchszustand, that Gegenstand, the poems are magical objects of use. And she was sure that whenever a poem is read, something else happens than what the poet could possibly have imagined in writing it. I wonder if you could carry that forward a bit, Marion.
Yes, I think so. That the most important thing is that Hilde Domin went through all the situations, all the feelings she had in her inner self, and that is the reason why she could transport it and give it back to others. And she in letters, she wrote to her husband, well, the difference between me and you is that I went through the feelings, Mitschmerz, for example. She created new words. She said, it's not, I don't pity someone, but I feel with him. I feel with him. So she created new words, and that was her fantasy. Even in everyday situations, we came to traffic lights, and she says, well, isn't it amazing how wie gehorsam, how obedient they are? So obedient traffic lights. So they are brand new words for normal situations. And that was astonishing, and that was remarkable, and that was part of her gift to see things in a different way and to express them in a different way.
That's so true. Meg, I wonder, can I bring you into the conversation as well? When you read these poems for the first time, what was your experience of Hilde Domin?
You know, Mark, it was, first of all, I read some of the poems, and then I went and read the introduction, the foreword, the essay, and but maybe you had sent me the introduction first, but I was going to say that the poems felt even more expansive, knowing a little bit about her and her background. And so, you know, because they are so compressed and so just the essence of language, they are like that one that you read. They allow the wind to come through the poems, and how we interpret that wind seems to me like it is even fuller to know the context of how she lived in her life. So they're very, very moving, and yet I admire just that simplicity in them.
Yeah. Well, one thing I haven't said anything about is where the title came from, and the Wandering
Yes,
Radiance.
Can you hold up a copy of the book? Because that cover art is just beautiful.
Yeah, I can thank Chris Nelson for finding it. Yeah, it really is stunning. But there's a poem that she wrote called Between Always and Always. Zwischen immer und immer. Which is a strange thing to say, isn't it? Between always and always. I mean, what could that possibly mean? And the puzzlement of simple words put together in startling ways is one of the things that is so alluring about her poetry. And it catches me up again and again in reading it. But let me read this, because this is a tumble of images that are nothing short of staggering in the way that they touch. Zwischen immer und immer leuchtend sanfte Fläche des Herzens, stille, ausgespannt, wie zwischen immer und immer, zwischen Morgen und Abend, von Buch zu Buch. Shining, soft surface of the heart, stillness, stretched out as between always and always, between morning and evening, from cove to cove. The boat with the white sail doesn't cut into the blue of your milk. The gull's quicker white that carries breath with it in wide loops leaves no trace behind, but the wandering radiance, the large, slow hand that unrelentingly caressing strokes you above the eternal heart, doesn't pause and pushes the hours away on the clock face of your shoreline. With her index finger made of shadow and gold, she signals the birds to keep silent in the wide palm basket of the night, and redeems the gift of this day from the tender, short blossom holiday of the gentle mimosas. A stunning poem. I mean, it's worth the cost of the book just to have that one poem, I think. And that sense of how radiance wanders. I remember reading one of her early poems, which she called The Saints, the Heiligen, which has these lines that I was so drawn to these two lines in that poem. The poem is amazing. It's in this book. It's a remarkable poem. But there are two lines that just leapt out at me when I first read them. She says, "Wir essen das Brot, aber wir leben von Glanz." We eat the bread, but we live from radiance. Wir leben von Glanz. Not von dem Glanz, we live from radiance. And in a sense, for someone to write that who has had a happy life, nothing but joy and butterflies and lovely vacations in the Caribbean would be one thing. But to write lines like that, having faced not just her own suffering, but the suffering of so many whom she knew, so many who did not escape the terror of war, the horror of Shoah, of the Holocaust, so many whose lives were crippled, were wounded. She dedicates one poem to 3 poets, Jewish poets, who took their own life in the early 1970s. One of them, Paul Celan, who survived in an internment camp and eventually moved to Paris and eventually jumped into the Seine River and just ended his life. So she lives with the burden of that anguish that's so heavy in this generation that faced the horrors of what happened with the German machine, war machine, and the extermination machine. But she refused to lose sight of the miracles, the small concrete miracles that are still, she said, always around us for those with eyes to perceive them. And I think that's just such a remarkable message that so many need in these times. We all need in these times. And such a different way of coming to the trauma that a society, an entire world really has come through and is again in the midst of, with another war that threatens to escalate beyond the Ukraine and Russia into God knows what it might become. Marion, can I bring you in, Marion?
Yes, I think in Radiance there is both. There is hope and nevertheless. So it's both expressed in this one word, I suppose. And this is what she never would lose in her life. She always stuck on hope. And that is very important. It's nevertheless, whatever you did, she said, no, we tried to make it in another way. And she moved on until her death. She decided to have all done what was necessary, to have all the operations done, but then she decided not to go on living any longer, and she died. Her heart stopped, and she died. It was her own decision, I suppose, and she had a strong will, and that's amazing, and that is very important if you think of Hilde Domin.
Yeah.
So beautiful, Mark. And I know there's still questions coming in and we're running out of time for that. Do you want to take one last question to wrap up?
I'm trying to see. Why don't you read one? I haven't been following.
Well, there was one that maybe Marion might address about her name, the choice of the name Domin.
Yeah.
Yes. Domin, depending on the Dominican Republic. And when she came back to Germany in 1954, she started publishing poems she had written in Santo Domingo. And her husband said, well, you are not a poet, the poet is me. And she wanted to leave the palm tree to him because Erwin Walter Palm. She said, well, I won't publish under your name. I'm not under the palm tree, but I will call myself after the country I was born as a poet. And it was a German journalist who told her, well, why don't you call yourself by the name of your island? And she has written at that time a poem. Mark, may I read it in German? Please. And you read it in English then?
Tell me the page. Yes, I'd be happy to.
Yes, it's page 12.
Oh yeah, there it is. Yep.
Landen dürfen. Ich nannte mich, ich selber rief mich mit dem Namen einer Insel. Es ist der Name eines Sonntags, einer geträumten Insel. Kolumbus erfand die Insel an einem Weihnachtssonntag. Sie war eine Küste, etwas zum Landen, Man kann sie betreten und die Nachtigallen singen an Weihnachten dort. Nennen sie sich, sagte einer, als ich in Europa an Land ging, mit dem Namen ihrer Insel.
Thank you. Allowed to land. I named myself. I personally called myself by the name of an island. It is the name of a Sunday, of a dreamt of island. Columbus discovered the island on a Christmas Sunday. It was a coastline, a place to land. One could step onto it. The nightingales sing there on Christmas. Name yourself, someone said to me as I went ashore in Europe, with the name of your island. Domin.
Beautiful.
Let me thank all of you for joining us for this really wonderful conversation, and particularly to those who've led us over the last hour and a half. Marion Tauschwitz, biographer of Hilde Domin, author, novelist, and friend of this project, who wrote the foreword for the book in Heidelberg. Chris Baukat, Chris Nelson from Grinnell, Iowa, my publisher, and a champion of all of these poems. There she is as a young woman. Marion's holding up. That's beautiful. And Hilary Davis from London, Welsh, Anglo poet and friend. Thank you all. And Meg, thank you for hosting this event again.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you all for coming.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Wonderful program.
Thank you.
very much.
Thank you.
Beautiful, beautiful.